Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Teach 250 series, Independence Revisited. It's got a much longer title that I don't remember the rest of, but we're really excited to have you all joining us tonight. First one of these we've done since they stopped that daylight savings. It's really dark out here. Not used to that, but here we are. So thank you all for joining us. I'm Ranger Jen from the National Mall. I'm with my colleague Bethany, Ranger Bethany. She's gonna join here in a second. And we have special guest appearance tonight from Ranger Kevin from the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. If you don't know Ranger Kevin, you are in for a treat. So our series for Teach 250 is thinking about how we can help teachers think about the topics of the anniversary coming up in 2026 of the Declaration of Independence. And this is a tough one. This is a topic I think we all deal with if we talk about the Declaration or Thomas Jefferson and the Revolution. The idea that these guys are fighting for independence, and yet there's this major element of their lives that does not match this idea of independence, and that is the issue of enslavement. So we were going to we're going to start talking about the Declaration from our perspective here on the National Mall and some of the different sites that have to do with the Declaration. Obviously here starting with the Jefferson Memorial, but we really hope you'll take to the chat box and chat with us a little bit. If you have thoughts or ideas, if you're teachers and you're struggle with this topic, or if you have great ideas of how you handle this topic. I don't know if Bethany was planning to mention this, but we've been struck in the last few years. We've had some school groups that come to visit the Jefferson Memorial and are really surprised that Jefferson gets a memorial. And so that's been a really interesting development for us to contemplate and how to talk to students about all of this. So if you all have thoughts and ideas, by all means, please throw it in the chat or ask some questions or answer our questions. And we'd love to engage with you on this topic if you have ideas. I wonder too, does it matter what part of the country you're teaching in? So yeah, please feel free to ask questions throughout and let us know what you think of this topic and how difficult or challenging it may be as teachers. Bethany, can I toss it to you?
Yes, thank you. Oops, as I start proceeding before I even talk. Yes, thank you. So as Jen kind of mentioned, I think one of the hardest memorials to have conversations at is the Jefferson Memorial, simply because, he is the author of the Declaration of Independence. He says some interesting, things within it. All men are created equal. And yet there is the idea that he also enslaved over 600 individuals during the course of his life. And so how do you kind of come to terms with writing these words and not living up to them? And as Jen said, we have a lot of particularly elementary school kids who have a hard time sort of reconciling that, asking us, well, if he did that, well, why does he have this memorial? And in just a bit here, we'll share kind of an interesting technique that we try to use, in regards to answering that question. But one of the things that I find really interesting about the Jefferson Memorial is I've really kind of done a deep dive into sort of the commission's ideas behind the design, behind the location. And one of the things that I found really interesting was the inscriptions that we have here in this memorial. And one of the things that I always kind of throw out to people is when you're building a memorial and you're talking about using the person's words, should it be an inscription? Should it be a quote? Should it be a sentence? Or should you have the entire address, speech, document listed on the wall? If you look at the Lincoln Memorial, you'll find the second inaugural address and the Gettysburg Address up there in its entirety. And yet, if we take a look at the Jefferson Memorial, we have 4 inscription panels, and there's some cutting and pasting going on. In one panel, we've got something like 96 words that come from 5 different sources. And so, what's the best practice? Is it allowing the audience to sort of make their own decisions as to what Jefferson is trying to say? or as the commission did, trying to think about, Jefferson wrote and said so many things, and there's not enough room on the panels to capture all of them. And so they said they tried to take some out of their, the text out of the time and place when they were deciding which sections to put on the wall. So it's kind of an interesting thought of how we build these memorials. And the declaration here is no exception. If you ever been to the Jefferson Memorial, just on the top there, you will find the committee of five. These are the five individuals who were kind of tasked with writing the declaration, and the other four decided that Jefferson was the best writer, and so they kind of throw the task to him and offer suggestions along the way. But if you're not familiar with who was on that committee, we've got Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Robert Sherman up there. And of course, Jefferson is standing there in the middle. And I believe this scene is based on the painting of this idea that they're kind of handing over the Declaration to Congress to review and to perhaps not to Jefferson's liking, edit as necessary. But then, of course, on one of the walls, we do have the Declaration of Independence. It was a foregone conclusion that this would be one of the inscriptions on the wall. But I found it kind of interesting is that the committee itself couldn't decide which part of the Declaration to actually place on this wall. And the part that we have up here now was not the original suggestion. And if you take a look at the declaration that we've got here, we have two of the five parts. We have part of the preamble and then part of the conclusion. And so the committee decided to kind of leave out the other three sections. So no mention of the introduction where Jefferson declares independence is unavoidable and even necessary. And no mention of the two main bodies, the section which kind of calls out King George and addresses all the grievances they have against him, or the part where they kind of suggest that, their British brethren didn't really take their concerns seriously. And if I kind of move this a little bit forward here, on the screen, kind of a side-to-side comparison of the declaration, the sections that we have up on the wall, and the suggestions, the inscription that was originally suggested. And you can see that the bottom part of that is vastly different, and the question is why? Why does not the original suggestion go up on the panel of the Jefferson Memorial? Does anybody want to take a guess as to why it was changed? Do we have any thoughts?
Perhaps it suggests division and destruction might incite violence in the future.
Well, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Wait, it's kind of that the two parts that are chosen are parts that the committee felt in many ways was the two sections that were most transferable to current and future events. So one of the things you'll notice is that there is no mention of Great Britain, there is no mention of King George. And so when this memorial is being built, it's the late 1930s, early 1940s. And so we are moving and then are in World War II. And so they kind of wanted this inscription to be able to speak to the things that are happening at the time. And so to remove the specifics and make it a more general part of the declaration, they felt met the needs of the time, which is kind of an interesting suggestion. There's also one member of the committee who was a senator. He actually disagreed with placing the conclusion in this inscription. And one of the reasons he kind of thought that it wasn't appropriate at the time is that he made the suggestion that Nazi soldiers were also pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And so he did not want that section on the memorial. He wanted to go with the original suggestion that this idea that if the government, isn't performing to the consent of the governed, then it should be able to be abolished. And he thought that was more appropriate in keeping with what was happening at the time. Again, kind of an interesting suggestion. He gets overruled, and the person that overrules him is the unofficial member of the Jefferson Memorial Commission, and that is the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And FDR really becomes the mover and shaker to get this memorial built. The legislation had languished in Congress for quite some time. It's not really advancing. It's not going anywhere until FDR takes office. A great admirer of Jefferson. He's the one that really kind of gets the ball moving to push this legislation through. And once it does, he becomes, again, an unofficial member of the commission. And so he is looking over designs. The inscription committee sends their thoughts to him, and he will be the one that asks them to change the end to the conclusion, not only because he thought it was very relatable to the time, but also he thought that these two sections were the sections that most people knew. If anyone knew anything about the Declaration and could quote a phrase from it, it would be from one of these two sections. And so it is FDR himself that encourages the committee to change it. And of course, being the president, they go ahead and go along with his wishes and his suggestions. They don't keep that part that they wanted because they only had so much room on the panel itself. And so they had to take out a section to put in what the president wanted. And so I think it's kind of an interesting story when we think about what parts of inscriptions, what part of documents, what part of speeches that we place in memorials are the parts that ultimately are chosen. Are they still relevant to people today? And so I think it's kind of an interesting thought. And then, you know, again, as Ranger Jen and I point out repeatedly to students, is that, yeah, Jefferson definitely did not live up to the words in which he had written. He certainly didn't follow the idea that all men are created equal. And one of the things that Ranger Jen and I find kind of interesting or amusing, perhaps, is that if you ask students a lot of times, who's missing from that phrase, of course, you know, you don't see women in there being mentioned as being created equal as well. And so we often ask them to sort of rephrase it. How would you rewrite that sentence? And it's this idea that all people are created equal or everyone's created equal. And so you can kind of ask students, you know, how would you rewrite this? Or what parts of the Declaration of Independence do you think are most appropriate or most relevant to the time? And then before I toss it to Kevin, because I think I'm taking up way too much time, another thing that I wanted to point out, and again, this is another technique that Jen and I often use. If you look at the location of three of our memorials, you'll notice that they are actually in a line. So we have the Lincoln Memorial, we have the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial right here, and we have the Jefferson Memorial. And this placement of these memorials was done on purpose. And if you kind of start here with Jefferson, who writes the Declaration, who puts these words out there, all men are created equal, we see sort of the evolution of the idea behind this phrase. We see it evolve. So we go from it being in the Declaration, Lincoln mentioning it in the Gettysburg Address, perhaps his most famous speech, where he kind of calls us out and says, you know, 7 years ago, we said all men are created equal. And yet we're really not living up to that, you know, to those words. And so we see this kind of evolution of the meaning behind that phrase. And then if we get here right in the middle to Martin Luther King Jr., he uses it in the I Have a Dream speech. And so we see the words and the meanings change again. So we see future generations taking this idea and sort of adding to it and using it to, you know, to really speak to the times and to who they believe are created equal. And so again, it's another sort of idea that we often use. So we see the movement of this, you know, of this phrase. Jen, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think you got it. You captured at least what we often share with the students that we work with. But for a whole nother perspective, let's throw it to Ranger Kevin from the Frederick Douglass House.
All right, so I'm going to try and stop sharing here. There we go.
Yeah, we have more stuff we can talk about, but we would much rather put it on Kevin to share with us because there's a whole nother part of this story that we haven't.
All right, thank you. And one of the things we do at the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site when we have conversations just such as this with students and with teachers is we like to spend our time immersed in Mr. Douglass's words and often let him kind of speak for himself as he did so frequently and so often. Specifically, I want to look at this conversation through the lens of probably the most famous speech that he is known for, his 4th of July address that he will give in 1852. When Frederick Douglass took the stage at Corinthian Hall, pictured here on the right side, he didn't have any idea how old he was. Somewhere in his 30s, this titan of history was standing in Rochester, New York to do the one thing that he did absolutely amazing, to use his words to try to craft America's future while also speaking to its past and where it's been. In 1852, Frederick Douglass was invited to give a 4th of July address. There was a gathered audience, and Mr. Douglass had made quite the name for himself in recent years. He'd been traveling all across the United States, commanding massive, massive crowds. And among these audiences, the roar of his voice over and over and over is calling people to action rather than complacency. The fire that was described as possessing in his eyes left individuals awestruck. As one person described it, seeing him on a stage, he was majestic in his wrath. Douglass had risked his life to publish his own story about the evils of enslavement. He had given names and dates and locations and every piece of information he needed to be hunted, and he was hunted after that. He spoke so much truth that on the advice of his allies, he needed to flee internationally, simply to stay alive against America's dastardly obsession in trafficking in human flesh. By the later 1840s, he launched his own newspaper back in America called the North Star, and he now had immersed himself as front and center, the dominant voice in America on the evils of slavery and the need for the United States of America to have a reckoning with what it said it was going to be in the past and what it was living out itself being in his observation of the future. And so on this 4th of July in 1852, America's most famous black man was asked to do what he had done many, many times before: stand on the stage of Rochester's Corinthian Hall and speak his mind. And we see here a historic image of that same hall, not on the occasion of his speech, but another event going in there to give you a feel for the size as hundreds gather in. Frederick Douglass accepts this invitation, but on one very specific condition: he will speak on the 5th of July. He will not give a 4th of July oration. When he confirmed his willingness to come on the 5th, as opposed to the 4th, this was now the 5th of July, the 25th anniversary of New York State's full abolition. Douglass has a ton on his mind, and so this society that sponsors his words sends out advertisements to bring people in. This is one of the originals here, where it reads, among so much else, on Monday, July 5th at 10 o'clock a.m., the Friends of Freedom will assemble in Corinthian Hall for the purpose of commemorating the glorious Declaration of 1776, made and signed by the immortal band of hero patriots, who for the maintenance of the principles set forth in that declaration pledged without compromise their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. After the reading of the Declaration of Independence, an oration will be delivered by Frederick Douglass, once a slave, now a firm supporter of the principles of the Declaration. And then it adds, refreshments may be obtained in the room below the hall. The mighty Douglass, who we see here in a photograph taken shortly before he gives this speech, giving us one of the best ideas of what he would have looked like at this precise moment in history. He is a self-emancipated husband, father, world-renowned activist who has arisen confidently, committed, and collected to this stage. He's pondering the meaning of 4th of July to America. He's pondering the meanings of independence, of freedom, of justice. And he is speaking not just to his audience in Corinthian Hall on that specific day. I think he knows he's speaking across time and space to a generation that he will never see. And so in that moment, I want to spend just a short time doing, in this case, the exact thing that we do with students from around the world when they come to visit, taking a glimpse at pieces of his speech, lifting back that veil of time for a moment and immersing ourselves in a few excerpts of one of the masterpieces of the English language, where Douglass opens in this speech in Corinthian Hall. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This, to you, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. Have you already caught the incredibly subtle language that he's using here that already begins addressing our very topic? Listen close to what he's saying, because no word that Mr. Douglass uses here is an accident. He continues, there is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed. Under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon, the eye of the reformer is met with angry flashes, portending disastrous times. But his heart may well beat lighter at the thought that America is young, and that she is still in the impressible stage of her existence. He's discussing liberty. He's discussing freedom. But again, notice the words. What are we hearing? Listen very closely to if you are hearing him say I, me, we, or is he saying you and yours and theirs? Take special note of those. That means a lot. They succeeded, and today you reap the benefits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ring bolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. Their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in strength to the distant future. They seized upon eternal principles and set a glorious example in their defense. Mark them. Admiration, respect, celebration. This all tracks with a 4th of July address, as we would expect to hear anywhere and any number of times. But for Mr. Douglass, the you, the yours, and the theirs are about to change big time as he continues. Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in the Declaration of Independence extended to us? The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed to you by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illumined temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems are in holy mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak here today? Douglass, now to his stunned audience in Corinthian Hall, uses Psalm 137 masterfully here, where it reads, By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there, they that carried us away captive required of us a song. And they who wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. For how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember those bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Douglass continues, identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Douglass is throwing it down here. He's slamming the hammer on them. But he also has a strategy for how you move forward when so much gross injustice seems as if it's a very part of the system itself. He tells his audience the methods of resistance. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability, and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke, for it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. Douglass is not calling for arguments. He's not calling for facts and figures. He's calling for ridicule, for sarcasm, for humor, for irony. So in light of Jefferson's declaration on the 4th, Douglass quickly reacts. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and your thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up the crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Douglass, as a theologian, is a drastically understudied subject, but his decades of musings upon American Christianity are poignant, powerful, and damning. And among some of that, he will describe in this very moment where he's understanding the role of the Declaration in the journey of injustice. He shares at the very moment that they are thanking God for the enjoyment of civil and religious liberty and for the right to worship God according to the dictates of their own consciences, they are utterly silent in respect to a law which robs religion of its chief significance and makes it utterly worthless to a world lying in wickedness. The church of this country is not only indifferent to the wrongs of the slaves, it actually takes sides with the oppressors. As his powerful baritone voice begins drawing all these threads together into this oratorical tapestry, he starts wrapping it up, addressing the very question of a nation and what it is in the essence of liberty, freedom, and justice. He's wrapping up with, Americans, your Republican politics, not less than your Republican religion, are flagrantly inconsistent. You boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 millions of your countrymen. You hurl your anathemas at the crowned-headed tyrants of Russia and Austria, and pride yourself on your democratic institutions, while you yourselves consent to be the mere tools and bodyguards of the tyrants at home. You invite to your shores fugitives of oppression from abroad. Honor them with banquets, greet them with ovations, cheer them, toast them, salute them, protect them, and pour out your money to them like water. But the fugitives from your own land, you advertise, hunt, arrest, shoot, and kill. You glory in your refinement and your universal education, yet you maintain a system as barbarous and dreadful as ever stained the character of a nation, a system begun in avarice, supported in pride, and perpetuated in cruelty. But given that this is a 4th of July address, Douglass has to talk directly about a piece of the subject that we are right now when he goes straight to Jefferson. You declare before the world that you hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet you hold securely in a bondage which, according to your own Thomas Jefferson, quote, is worse than ages of that which your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose. You hold a 7th part of your inhabitants in your country. Douglass here uses Jefferson's own words to reinforce his point, a point that Jefferson himself seems to have acknowledged, but failed to live up to in many ways. But alas for Douglass, at the end here, it's not all doom and gloom. He ends by saying, I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence and the great principles it contains and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Godspeed the year of Jubilee, the wide world o'er. Until that year, day, hour arrive, with head and heart and hand I'll strive. In both secular and sacred terms, Frederick Douglass has just delivered one of the greatest speeches in American history. It's complicated. It's ugly. It's full of hypocrisy when you get to the essence of independence. But in his ponderings on this subject, including liberty and freedom, the America that he spoke to was beyond his audience. Almost as if he knew he was joining some of those great thinkers of the past, almost as if he's speaking to a dimension beyond time, a space inhabited by some of humanity's greatest accomplishments, achievements, work of art, a place where things last for centuries. And as Douglass stood on that specific day explaining his nation's historical condition, through the pain of this indictment and the force of the altar call he's laid out, he is illuminating the path to a better day, using the same documents that can be problematic, drawing them as also the tools for the future. Douglass, the ironist, has never been better, converting collective suffering into national hope. And so as America's prophet took his seat from the podium, the nearly 600 present roared with ovation in a universal burst of applause. Frederick Douglass now shared the truths that he felt to be self-evident. And in so doing, he reached out to those of the past who had let freedom ring. And when they let freedom ring, important as that was, perhaps from his perspective, you could have answered the phone when freedom was ringing. For Douglass is now metaphorically sitting on the other end of that line, hoping and trusting and believing that one day the future might likewise answer that phone and seek a better path. But until then, as he told us in his symphony of words, I'll wrap up my little section with this before we open it up for questions and feedback and a little informality. As Douglass told us in this moment, we need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. For when it comes to independence, when it comes to justice, when it comes to freedom and liberty, he also said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. For this moment, I'll stop sharing and we can open up our floor.
I had to comment to Bethany that just the way you presented the picture of him with the words that you were saying of his, I mean, it was just came across as very powerful. And I think our attendees agreed. We do have a question about the audience and who was he speaking to in that hall? Was it abolitionists? Was it politicians? What was the makeup of the crowd? Do we know?
Great question. Yes. So about 600 people come in. We know exactly who invited him. It is the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Sewing Society, which is a group of abolitionists who've been trying to piece together the work in kind of upstate New York, rekindle things. But they are, like, for lack of a better term, they are his echo chamber. So these are people who are going to be sharing something very similar in the worldview. They have been funding him, and this is all a big fundraiser to support the broader abolition work. They don't know what he's going to say. It's going to shock him. It's going to challenge him. But he's also, in as safe a place as he can be to share something like this.
Okay, so you got a comment of wow, just wow. Anybody else have any comments or questions they want to share? That was pretty powerful words, and boy, it sure, he really got at the heart of this issue of just how could these guys have been, clamoring for independence, but then taking it away from other people. It's just a mind-boggling thing. And wow, to have been in that room would have been something.
That's also an important element for us to retain here too, because it is really easy and almost unfair to dogpile on some of these founding fathers and things like that's the easy way out. That's the low-hanging fruit. And at first glance, that is what Douglass does here. But at second glance, he spends a whole opening celebrating their role, saying they deserve remembrance. They are brave. They are patriots. They are heroes. He winds it back through saying, yeah, these problematic people, they also set the way for how we get this right moving forward. So he doesn't just slam them. He's like, there's a lot here. We can't just throw it aside. Let's celebrate, rejoice, and move forward together with their vision, imperfect as it might have been.
Was that a strategy of his? Because I think of the other speech that I've heard you speak on, and we've talked about before, when they dedicate the Emancipation statue, and he kind of does both sides, doesn't talk nice about Lincoln, and then does kind of talk nice about Lincoln. So it seems kind of parallel in the same way that he did this, right? I mean, was that something he did in a lot of his speeches?
This is very intentional. He knows how to kind of bait and switch his audience to point, or that might be the wrong word choice to use. But in terms of, he knows how to lure an audience in. Because if we're going to 4th of July speech, that's exactly what we're expecting to hear. Celebrations of the past, many of us. And he starts with that, a fair, honest expression. He says, now that I've got you, by the way, let's look at the other side. And if I start with the other side, I might already lost you.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's how we all are feeling too about the 250th as it's coming up. Is it a celebration? Is it a commemoration? What exactly should it look like? What about all the people that have been left out? Besides this speech, did Douglass ever speak or write on Jefferson or the founder specifically?
He writes and he speaks several times in big picture about the founders, not boiling it down to Jefferson directly in that. But he does a lot of aggressive speaking about that, specifically in the later 1850s after the Dred Scott decision, things where he starts proclaiming about our Bill of Rights as a Bill of Wrong, talking about all the hypocrisies as he understands it in it. So the later 1850s, he is tearing those documents apart, which is after this specific speech even.
There's a comment in the chat box. It says parallels to now. I don't know if you want to go with that or what.
Yeah, I touch on it very, very briefly for us in a moment. Anyway. touch on it very, very briefly, because that is one of the powerful things about both what has been presented to us by seeing the words on the Jefferson, the symbolism, the statues, its history, where it's originated from, as well as with Douglass's words. None of the three of us have to tell you all what to think about these questions. None of us have to connect dots for you. We may, even amongst the three of us, we may connect different dots in our own minds. The second these conversations start getting shared, whether with teachers, with educators, or when we do this with students, and we do this exact thing with students like that, they're already making those parallels on their own, whether spoken or not. You can see the light bulbs clicking in people's eyes that they know what's going, or they know, their life experience of how they're hearing historic words from both of these individuals. And yet we don't always hear these words as historic, as they sit carved into a monument, or as they're being read in one of the locations where they were delivered. So we let people draw their own parallels, and it's hard not to.
So for students who are confused about the juxtaposition of the ideal of all men being created equal while other men are enslaved, how would you respond?
That is the essence of the question, I suppose, for us. When we do our programs, which can be in person, sometimes between going to the Jefferson Memorial and the Douglass House back and forth, or when we do them online, that's one of the areas where, at least in my experience, and feel free for either of you to chime in, where I feel it most useful, that we present something along the lines of a modified version of what we did, and then say, and then we go silent. You make these connections. You draw the understandings. You discuss the hypocrisy amongst yourselves and kind of work through it with a guided, facilitated, healthy dynamic. But we're not there to try to answer the questions. I want to give you enough context that you can understand what's going on, and then bring your wisdom in and teach us how you are understanding this, because it is hard. And people, even elementary school kids, others, they can get fired up about this stuff when you get them going.
Yep. Yeah, we tend to use the Jefferson statue. For those who may not have been there or seen it up close or looked around a lot, we have students and we're usually dealing with elementary students. We have them look around the statue and find examples of how Jefferson was a farmer. Because if you've ever, maybe not looked too closely, but on the backside of the Jefferson statue are two crops represented. They're kind of holding him up. And so we get to the getting to a tough issue through sort of a exploratory way, maybe, or without having to, as you say, tell them, but let them kind of figure it out. So when you find the tobacco and the corn that are on the back of the Jefferson statue, and you get a sense that Jefferson was a farmer, the question becomes, did Jefferson do the work himself on his farm? And then you can turn and point to the words of Declaration of Independence and see all men are created equal, and stand there and go, okay, so now what? And I mean, that's exactly what we try to do with them at the memorial, is this getting them to think about this bizarre situation of how this man could write these words and then not live up to them.
While you were talking, it reminded me of a quote of Douglass that I think speaks a little bit to this idea we're going into, where the imploring, at least for me, is that students remember these are real human beings, both of them, no matter what we think of them. They're not, Jefferson and Douglass are not just people on statues, on podiums, presiding over us, real human beings with all that stuff. And Douglass is trying to connect this idea of the humanity to the individuals, which I think we can easily use to appeal to students. He's going to make a quote in 1857 that every man, he says man, every person is abolitionist enough to know slavery is wrong for them. But not everyone is abolitionist enough to realize that slavery is wrong for others. And it's this basic appeal, deep, that we have this conversation in our classrooms. Every kid is going to know, I don't deserve to be treated that way. And they are 100% spot on. They do not deserve that treatment. So the question is, but can you take the you and recognize that there's a bunch of other yous around you who also therefore do not deserve? That's where where the rubber hits the road. It's not good enough for me. I should not deserve it. Therefore, you shouldn't either. It should be the next extension of it.
Right. Yeah, there it is. Well said, man. He knew how to say things, didn't he? Anybody have anything they want to ask? You've got a great person to ask here, and or share any experiences you've had with this topic. Any other questions you might want to talk about? Could always get Kevin to talk to us about how photographed Douglass was, as I see his backdrop with all these pictures.
I see a statement in here. I'm assuming a question about how he developed his rhetoric,
Yeah.
or so. There's where I think that's probably pointing us to. Yeah. So Douglass's main, all right, there we go. Douglass's main skill that he's going to draw this from is, aside from his sheer grit and determination, a book called The Columbian Orator. When Douglass is enslaved for the first 20 years of his life, he's developed full literacy out of himself when he's 13 years old. He's been working on it for years before that. And among the earliest books he gets his hands on is one that he will buy for a quarter. The Columbian Orator, a 1797 compilation of theology, philosophy, politics, a debate not just in an American context. This book, among so much else, has a series of basically like public speaking tips in it, how to be an effective speaker. But for Douglass, what he also takes away from it, there is one specific section in the Columbian Orator that not just is telling you how to command an audience, how to speak well, how to enunciate, all that sort of traditional stuff as they would be teaching at that point. There's an excerpt that's called A Dialogue Between a Master and a Slave, which is not written in an American context, kind of an ancient world context, but the core of it is that an enslaved person and the so-called master are having an intellectual debate about the rights and wrongs of slavery. Young Douglass is reading this, balancing that with the idea of how you convey arguments, how you philosophize that, how you speak on a stage. And he realizes you can discuss slavery publicly with the very enslavers, and you have the moral, the ethical, and the intellectual right on your side, and you can win those arguments. And turns that into then the pathway for his life. But the first key part in that pathway, I got to figure out how to get myself out of slavery. But he doesn't wait to escape before he starts trying to undermine the system from the inside. So his rhetoric, that development becomes manifested when he's 13, 14, 15 years old, running underground secret schools as a teacher on the platforms for the other enslaved around him, trying to equip them with the tools to bust themselves out. Well, he's trying to figure out, how do I get out too? So I hope that spoke a little bit to what you were going for there.
Made me think about oratory skills and all of that. Maybe you should make a plug for your program that you all do every year.
That is true. So we have the Frederick Douglass Oratorical Competition that goes on for school children every year. Registration is still open. It's open through the 16th. It encourages students from age 6 to 18 to come together either in person at Douglass's home, or we offer a virtual option where they memorize portions of a Douglass speech and put their own kind of spin on portraying that to an audience. And there are judges, very significant prizes that go into play for it. It is a major event. It has been going on for decades. And it's been helping that new generation find just these old words and realize just how not old sometimes they feel. And I'll add on the Columbian Orator real quick. One of the other people using the Columbian Orator at the same time, Abraham Lincoln, is also studying from the exact same oratorical book that Frederick Douglass is. They're in very different environments, but that's going to be something uniting them together later. So a prominent book for its time.
We know if they ever talked about it?
They talked a bunch of times. We don't know that they ever talked specifically about that book.
Interesting. Yeah. I have a link to the contest info.
Yes, I can get
I
that.
have judged years ago. I was a judge, and if anybody is local to the DC area, it is certainly worth coming out to see. I remember, and I think it happens a lot, right? Students dress up as Douglass, and it's so neat opportunity to come out and see it. They're really amazing.
So I'm dropping that link in the chat for those that are interested.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other Douglass stuff? Questions? Declaration questions? Anything else?
It can be Jefferson stuff too.
Yeah, I know, I guess. We're just excited to have you with us and want to take advantage of our time with you. So yeah, we could talk Jefferson if you'd like. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Bethany, anything else you want to throw out there?
Don't think so. Another thing that we sometimes tend to do, and it can be confusing for our younger audiences simply because sometimes the whole timeline situation can be confusing. But both the statues of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the statue of Thomas Jefferson, both of them are holding documents, rolls, rolled up piece of papers. Neither of them have ever been identified, so neither sculptor ever tells us what they are, because it's to reference everything that both of them had either written or said. But sometimes we like to challenge students, if the two were writing one another, what would their positions be regarding all men are created equal? What would their justifications be for what they believed and what they thought? And you could even sort of turn that into having your students write to both of them as well, and kind of having this discussion and this argument, in terms of what those words truly mean. And I think I saw somebody had thrown a question in there about whether or not Jefferson, what was the question? Whether or not Jefferson
Ever felt conflicted about?
So Jefferson does write a letter later on in his life where he does he does say that he was unable to untangle himself from slavery, but he'd hoped that future generations would do better than he. And so, yeah, I mean, I think if we look at early Jefferson, he does write and speak out against enslavement. But as he gets towards, the latter part of his life, it becomes less and less. But he does recognize that in that letter that he does not live up to those words.
Just through your quoting out of context lesson ideas in the chat, if you want to give just a quick summary of or just kind of an idea of what that was about.
Yeah, so again, when I really started to look into how the Jefferson Memorial came to be and some of the arguments, disagreements over location, design, and Jefferson definitely had more than its fair share. We often say that all the monuments and memorials in the park had some sort of controversy associated with them. Jefferson had many. And so it took quite a long time, again, to get this memorial built, to get final designs. But the inscription portion of it was one that I really kind of found fascinating. And I had so many questions as I'm reading some of the documents associated with their thought process and this idea, again, of taking that text out of their time, and sort of compiling them together to kind of have this narrative that might not have been what Jefferson actually meant. And so in some of these lesson plans, it kind of explores that thought process. It explores some of the reasons why they chose specific inscriptions. There was a Jefferson descendant in the committee, and he tried his best to try and convince the other committee members that Thomas Jefferson was this country's first abolitionist. And he points to some of Jefferson's early rhetoric in terms of in terms of slavery and enslavement, and he uses that as his arguments. And most of the other committee members, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt, aren't willing to take it that far, and so they disagree with that notion. But yeah, there's really just so much into the thought process associated with choosing those inscriptions. And out of all the things that Jefferson wrote and Jefferson said and Jefferson did, why did they choose what they chose? Yeah, go FDR. And so, yeah, so it's kind of an interesting series. It takes you through each of the panels, poses some questions, poses some ideas, and set some activities and engagements associated with how should you choose words in relation to a memorial.
Evan, you wanted to add something?
Yeah. So as we're kind of wrapping up on time, I wanted to share something as a potential resource. Maybe some folks, this is, to be clear, this is not an endorsement in any way, shape, or form, but because it directly affects the topic that we are discussing, and it many of us would probably find it mildly amusing. There is a YouTube series called Epic Rap Battles of History, where it puts individuals from history against each other. And by happenstance, well, probably not by happenstance, intentionally, I imagine, one of the epic rap battles of history that exists is between Thomas Jefferson and Frederick Douglass. It's only a couple minutes long, and it kind of captures the key themes of what we've been talking about, grounding them, giving them each a chance to defend themselves and kind of attack the other in that kind of playful rap style. It is not necessarily classroom appropriate because there is strong language that is used back and forth between the two. But
So we could have
For the-
just shown that tonight and not had you here at all. Is that what you're saying?
as long as we had the bleeps going at the right times, because as is to be expected, if we take these two real individuals and put hypothetical versions of them against each other, it gets animated sometimes as they're spitting bars back and forth at each other. But it's worth checking out, especially if you joined us for this thing, because it's something that is somehow connecting with you. And you may not use it, but there may be seeds of what you can take from it that you would find. So if you just go on YouTube and type in like Thomas Jefferson versus Frederick Douglass, it's probably going to be the very first thing that pops up. I don't directly want to share the link through my government system here, but you can find it real easy. It's got millions and millions of views. And interesting conversations in the comment sections too. That's right down there.
Fun. Oh, fun. Well, awesome. Okay, we have just a couple minutes, so it's time for last call, so to speak. Yeah, thank you all for joining us, and thank you for your comments and questions and all. Know that I'm pretty sure, right, we're all available for virtual programming if you're not in the area. Certainly on the mall, we do a lot of virtual programs as well as in person. If you are close by, Kevin, Frederick Douglass's house, boy, it's an amazing resource if you have not been there. And they are willing to talk with you virtually as well. So consider this an opportunity to reach out to us if there's anything we can do to help with your classes. And we thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I know there are lots of other opportunities and things you could be doing, so thank you for spending some time with us. And thank you again to Kevin for joining us. Thank you very much. Bethany for showing up again as always. And our friends at the Trust for the National Mall, they're our partner in all of this, and they host our Zooms for us. So we really appreciate them engaging with us and all of you on these programs. So yeah, we'll be back in December, second Tuesday. And we are going to be joined by the U.S. Institute of Peace, an organization that's a worldwide organization, but they're based here in D.C. And they're literally across the street from us, and they will be joining us for a look at the work that they do and the resources that they have for teachers. I think it's the 10th, but I can't remember. Second Tuesday. You'll get an email if you signed up for this one. You'll get an email about the next one. So thank you all so much again for joining us, and thank you to everybody who participated. Have a good evening.